Hello again from Metro Manila, the Philippines, Southeastern Asia. On October the 11th of this year, 2018, will come to pass 10 years since the death in a single vehicle crash of one of the most controversial and notorious late 20th and early 21st century politicians, Mr. Jörg Haider of Austria. He was known as a right-wing populist politician who had basically two different versions, at least two different versions for his statements. He had one version for those people who were fascinated by certain aspects of the failed German Nazi regime, such as the outward orderliness, the honoring of patriotic and nationalist ideals, and a strong army and military bravery. He steered clear, of course, of the Holocaust's sordid legacy. And then, to those Austrian voters of more moderate political persuasions, he emphasized his superficial support for referendums and other forms of direct democracy, his self-acclaimed support for more freedom of enterprise, the privatization of various state-owned businesses and corporations, the lowering of taxes, and generally speaking, the championing of greater individual freedom. At the start of his political career in the 1970s and 1980s, he strongly denounced the Proporz system, whereby Austria's two dominant political parties of that time, the Socialists, or later Social Democrats, and then the center-right People's Party, divided up the public sector civil service positions based on the latest federal parliamentary election results. It was called, therefore, the proportional system. It was also called the Parteibuchschaftswirtschaft, or Parteibuchwirtschaft, or economy based on the party membership cards. He claimed that this resulted in a massive and inefficient bureaucracy, which to some extent was true, and kept many qualified Austrians outside those federal civil services top positions. When in 1986, in September 1986 to be more specific, he was elected as the Austrian Freedom Party's new chairman, defeating the moderate and centrist liberal chairman, who at that time was serving as the vice chancellor or deputy prime minister of Austria at the federal level, Mr. Norbert Steger, and who was very similar to the West German Free Democratic politicians, and indeed had been in a so-called small coalition with the Social Democrats since 1983. The Freedom Party was a minor political party which typically received in the federal parliamentary elections for the National Council, the Austrian federal parliament's lower house, around 5 to 6% of the vote, while the Social Democrats received over 40% and or even over 45%, and the People's Party received over 40% of the vote. Haider himself had in 1979, aged just 29, been elected to the Austrian National Council. However, he had focused more on building a career in his home state of Kärnten, or Carinthia in English, the southernmost of Austria's 9 federal states. As a result of Haider's election as the new federal chairman of the Austrian Freedom Party, the Austrian Federal Chancellor or Prime Minister, Mr. Franz Vranitzky, who was leading the Social Democrats, announced that the Social National Liberal coalition would be over. Therefore, Federal Chancellor Vranitzky asked the federal president, Kurt Waldheim, to dissolve the Austrian National Council and to call early elections, which Federal President Waldheim did. Already in those elections that were held just 2 months after Haider had become the Freedom Party's federal chairman, the Freedom Party was able to break out of the 5 to 6% range of vote, and at the time of Haider's election, a growing number of Freedom Party members and supporters had even feared that it would eventually lose votes, because it had lost votes in some state legislative elections, perhaps even in a few municipal elections, unless it broke ranks from the or with the Social Democrats and tried to appeal to its German nationalist voter base. It was able to get over 9% of the vote and 18 seats out of 183. This, of course, was not enough to bring it back to the government. Nevertheless, it showed that Haider had dynamism. And during the next 3 parliamentary terms, let's see, 3 or 4 ones. 3, 2. Yeah, during the next 4 parliamentary terms, Haider was able to raise the, let's see, during the next 2 federal parliamentary elections of Austria, Haider was able to increase the Freedom Party's support by over double, from over 9% to over 20%. In 1995, the party suffered a small temporary setback, losing 1 or 2 seats, but in 1999 it was able to get almost 27% of the vote, actually some hundreds of votes more than the People's Party. Although the Social Democrats still remained as the largest single political party of Austria at the federal level, the People's Party's chairman at that time, Foreign Minister and Vice Chancellor Wolfgang Schüssel, decided to form a right-wing coalition government with the Freedom Party. The Austrian federal president, Mr. Thomas Klestil, reluctantly approved the coalition after Haider had signed an agreement whereby he would support the Austrian rule of law and democracy. So in February 2000, this coalition entered into power with Mr. Schüssel as the federal chancellor and Ms. Susanne Ries-Passer as the foreign minister and vice chancellor. The European Union, that economic, political, military, and social organization where most European countries now belong, including Austria, then decided to apply limited diplomatic sanctions, whereby in the EU summits the Austrian representatives would not be greeted as openly as the other EU states' representatives, while Mr. Haider withdrew from the Freedom Party's federal chairmanship. He nevertheless remained as the party's strongman. He had already from 1989 to 1991 served as the state premier or governor in German Landeshauptmann of Carinthia. He had had to resign after having apparently praised Nazi Germany's employment policies because his state government had introduced a law in the state legislature that would have required a work service by that state's unemployed people who were seeking work. When a social democratic deputy denounced it as reminiscent of Nazi Germany's slave labor or forced labor, Governor or Premier Haider quickly replied, "No, it wouldn't be like Nazi Germany or the Third Reich, because the Third Reich had an effective employment policy which not even your government in Vienna," meaning the Social Democratic People's Party federal coalition government, "can bring about." At that time, however, Austria had one of continental Europe's lowest unemployment rates, despite the onset of that worldwide early 1990s economic recession. And in April 1999, having won a plurality of the vote in the state legislative elections in Carinthia, Haider was returned to office there, and again in 2004. However, differences between him and the Freedom Party's federal leaders grew, and that led to his establishment of a breakaway populist party, Alliance for the Future of Austria, or Bündnis der Zukunft Österreichs. In 2006, the party was able to narrowly clear the 4% vote threshold required for assured representation in the Austrian National Council, and just weeks before Haider's death, the party was able to get over 10% of the vote in the Austrian federal parliamentary elections. And Haider seemed poised to become once again a factor at the federal level in Austrian politics, although his former home party or political party, the Freedom Party, had received over 17% of the vote and was still several percent ahead of the Alliance for the Future of Austria. And then when he spoke to foreign journalists, he denounced Nazism and far-right politics and claimed that he was simply championing the causes of ordinary Austrian voters. He wanted lower taxes, less bureaucracy, more incentives for the ordinary Austrians to establish businesses and to keep more of their earned money. And he also supported direct democracy like binding referendums and so forth. He did strongly oppose a liberal immigration policy, especially coming from the Muslim countries, but interestingly also from the broken former Yugoslavia. And this rang a bell especially for voters in southern Austria, because southern Austria borders on Croatia, one of the breakaway republics of former Yugoslavia. And the Yugoslav Civil War, which broke out in earnest in 1991, massively increased, for some years at least, the number of refugee claimants elsewhere in Europe, including Austria. He also opposed special rights to the Carinthian traditional linguistic minority, the Carinthian Slovenes, once even physically removing a bilingual German-Slovene sign. Slovenes are a southeastern European Slavic ethnic group who have existed probably for centuries in southern Austria. Interestingly, the current US First Lady, Melania Trump, is from Slovenia, a small country in southeastern Europe. He even received support from two deposed and executed dictators, Muammar al-Gaddafi, or Gaddafi of Libya, and Saddam Hussein of Iraq. So how did he die? He died of injuries from a single vehicle crash at Lambichel in Köttmansdorf near Klagenfurt in the state of Carinthia in the early hours of October the 11th, 2008. He had been on his way to celebrate his mother's 90th birthday. According to the official police report, the Volkswagen Phaeton that Haider had been driving came off the road, rolled down an embankment, and overturned, causing his instantaneous or quick death of severe head and chest injuries. On the evening of October the 10th, 2008, he had quarreled with his close friend and political supporter, Mr. Stefan Petzner. Allegedly, he had then met a young man, and he had been spending time, apparently, according to the official report, in a homosexual bar. At the time of the crash, Haider's car was traveling at 142 kilometers per hour or faster, so over twice the legal speed limit of 70 kilometers per hour for that part of the Leubel Pass road. The Austrian police rejected then and have rejected since conspiracy theories about Haider's death. Then, for years, Haider had been rumored, despite the fact that he had been married since 1976 and had two daughters, to have been a closeted homosexual or bisexual. Indeed, shortly before or shortly after Governor or Premier Haider's death, Mr. Petzner gave an interview where he claimed that Haider was his Lebensmensch, or the man of his life, although this expression can also be translated as icon or mentor. He claimed that there was something truly special between the two men, and that he had loved Haider as his best friend. He also implied that their relationship went far beyond a normal friendship, and that Mrs. Haider was fully aware of it. Mr. Haider had neither denied nor confirmed rumors about his possible sexual deviance, although it had been noted that he liked having young men around him, first in the Austrian Freedom Party and then during his last years in the Alliance for the Future of Austria. And indeed, the Austrian Freedom Party had been mocked by some of its critics as the party of Haider's boys. Be that as it may. His widow strongly denies that Mr. Haider was a homosexual. He still questions, or she still questions, the official account of the accident. It is true, however, that Premier Haider was driving under the influence of alcohol. According to his autopsy, Haider's blood alcohol level was 1.8 milligrams per liter, more than 3 times the legal limit of 0.5 milligrams per liter. The Austrian federal president, Heinz Fischer, said that Haider's death was a human tragedy. Reactions in the Austrian press were mixed. Mr. Wolfgang Fellner, publisher of Österreich, wrote, "I have fought bitterly with Jörg Haider. but finally Haider became a gentle, considerate, almost wise politician. Alas, he was once again too fast. Haider died as he lived, always full throttle, always over the limit, Fellner concluded. But Ernst Trost pointed out in the Kronen Zeitung, one of Austria's mainstream newspapers, that while Haider had enjoyed a comet-like rise in politics, he had also ever again embarked on self-destructive actions and provoked opposition. The chief editor of Kurier, another major Austrian newspaper, Christoph Kotanko, wrote that however much his brown tones, xenophobia and aggressive populism were to be rejected, Haider's criticism of the dominant conditions of the 1980s and 1990s was partly also justified, and he had named, fought, and in part also changed those conditions. In October 2009, following an appeal by Haider's widow, Mrs. Claudia Haider, who had sued the German newspaper Bild Zeitung, literally picture newspaper, for publishing interviews with a man claiming to have been Jörg Haider's lover for many years. An Austrian court ruled it illegal for media to call Jörg Haider a homosexual because it would be a breach of personal and privacy rights. In its ruling, the court threatened a fine of up to 100,000 euros for anybody who claims or distributes the claim that Jörg Haider was a homosexual and or bisexual and or that he has had a male lover. According to a confiscated black booklet handwritten by Mr. Walter Maischberger, a former Freedom Party politician, Austrian authorities said they would examine a diary that allegedly detailed money transfers from Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi. The diary reportedly mentions a $58.7 million US transfer from Gaddafi, as well as more than $13.3 million US that unidentified individuals brought back from Iraq. It also references an anonymous confidant who supposedly brought a suitcase filled with $6.6 million US from Switzerland to Munich for investment purposes. The money was supposed to have come from a Swiss account belonging to the deceased sons of the former of the late and deposed and executed Iraqi dictator Mr. Uday Hussein and Mr. Qusay Hussein.